Great, well, thanks for joining us today for this webinar on setting yourself up for success in the Diploma in Translation. So my name's John Worne, I'm the Chief Executive of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, and I'm joined today by Olivia Morton, who is a member and is also an MA holder and is also a holder of the DipTrans. So welcome, Olivia.
Thank you, John. Yeah, so as John already mentioned, I am a member of CIOL and took the DipTrans back in 2021. I'm a translator from German to English predominantly, although I do also offer Russian to English quite selectively. And I'm a member of a variety of professional associations. I've been a freelancer for a number of years and yep, absolutely really enjoy it and have been delighted with my achievement in the DipTrans and just kind of wanted to share the knowledge that I've gained along the road with everyone.
Fantastic. Well, what we're going to try to cover today is we're going to have a conversation about the DipTrans, hopefully cover off all of the questions that the audience might have on it. And just to kick us off, Olivia, perhaps you might tell us, you know, yourself as a successful translator and of course a successful DipTrans holder, what do you think the main benefits of taking and passing the DipTrans are? Is it worth all the hard work and effort?
I think it really entirely the reasons for doing it probably depend on where each candidate already is in their career. I think for me, I kind of chose to take the DipTrans both really as a personal challenge, but also to kind of prove and get down on paper, I suppose, the practical skills that I'd already acquired as a translator. And I think when I say to prove them, I mean kind of both to myself, but also to my current clients and my future clients. So I would say it's difficult to really generalize, but I think definitely one of the main benefits is probably confidence in your ability and kind of having verified your existing ability. But also in terms of kind of translation as a relatively unregulated profession, being able to prove that you do meet certain standards and verify those skills is really significant. Obviously, it also offers the advantages of sort of membership of associations and I think is quite a good international benchmark standard in terms of proving your skills.
Yeah, excellent. And that point about confidence, I think, is really important. Could you describe how that's helped you, maybe in your conversations with clients?
Well, I suppose sometimes as a freelance translator, it feels like you sort of exist in a bit of a vacuum, really, whereby you're kind of working with your own clients, and that can sometimes be a little impersonal, and sometimes can be quite personal depending on the client and the relationship you have with them. But I think sometimes it does feel like because you're working largely alone, you exist in a bit of a vacuum. You're kind of not really aware what other translators are doing, what kind of level they're working at, and sometimes that can feel a bit odd. I think as well, working with a lot of clients based in German-speaking countries, perhaps a little more value is placed on sort of qualifications and verifiability of those qualifications. So I think for me, with that kind of context of my work, being able to prove that I have reached that standard, met that standard, and can prove that with a document is really valuable to me.
Yeah, very, very good. Now, thinking about people who may be watching us here and who may be thinking about whether they want to take the DipTrans, what do you think would be the considerations they might want to take into account? Obviously, it's a very personal choice, but where do you think in their career or in their life they would ideally be to be successful in the DipTrans?
Like you say, that is very personal. I would probably say my personal opinion on that would be that it's perhaps not necessarily the way to go into the DipTrans straight from your undergrad or straight from your master's. I do think that you could probably achieve the best results and sort of do justice to the exams with some professional experience of translating behind you and sort of having that background and that confidence to tackle a wide variety of texts which that gives you. And I know that is quite difficult to generalize because sort of standards of both language skills, translation skills, and sort of competence in your target language do vary quite drastically among graduates of undergrad and postgrad degrees. But I would definitely say, in my opinion, it's a really great qualification to sort of add to your portfolio once you've been a professional translator for, at least a few years.
Yes, and if that is the archetypal candidate, one of the challenges, I guess, would be preparing alongside your work. So, is that one of the things that was a consideration for you, that you're doing the preparation alongside work? Did that make it easier or harder for you?
I suppose both in different ways. I think it might be quite easy to say, on the one hand, I have my preparation, on the other hand, I have my work, but they do kind of also both flow into each other. I think if you are translating a wide variety of text and you are actually working in the fields which you're intending to translate in the DipTrans exams, you can actually use your professional paid work as preparation to some extent. So I think practicing as a translator is really valuable for preparation. But again, that's just one angle on it. At the same time, it is tricky to make time for preparation, which is obviously essentially unpaid work around your schedule, as someone who's already quite busy as a professional. I think does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, that might take us nicely on to the question of exam preparation. So, everyone's different. People will be coming from different starting points and will have different endpoints in mind. But, were there any kind of top tips or recommendations you would have in terms of preparation for the DipTrans?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different ways to kind of maximize on how you prepare for them and to make that more effective. But I definitely think kind of slowly but surely working through your preparation is the best way to approach it, rather than kind of leaving it to the last minute and then hoping to succeed. I would say kind of regular preparation, regular learning. I guess also identifying your weaknesses, but really truly understanding kind of what potential pitfalls you might encounter, learning how to manage your time and how to increase your efficiency, I suppose.
And one of the questions that we're often asked is, do you think it's helpful to take a preparatory course? What would you say about preparatory courses? Did you manage to take one, or were you not able to do that?
I wasn't able to take a preparatory course. I definitely think it's entirely up to you. Courses can definitely add value, but that's only if you find a really good one for your language pair. The financial commitment is quite important there in terms of factoring that in, because obviously the exams are a significant commitment. Um, so it is definitely possible to be successful in the exams without a course. I would say that's predominantly if you have the right experience kind of going into the preparation, but actually a good course can really add value. And ultimately, I think it would make preparation kind of a less lonely experience. I think a regular course would also somewhat automate that element of needing to schedule in the regular prep and give you accountability. But ultimately, the things that you could achieve in a course, you could also achieve yourself, I think.
Yes, I think that's a very fair summary, and certainly I think it is great if people can take a course. There are some excellent course providers out there, and they really do help. But as you say, I think with the right preparation, a candidate can be successful without a course as well. So it's not. I think this is one of the benefits of professional qualifications, that they do enable you to be flexible in your approach to preparation. Because ultimately they're about confirming the achievement of specific learning outcomes. They're about demonstrating that you can do the specific task which is required in the work, and to some extent that is a combination of study, but also a combination of practice and your own preparation. So I think as you say, I would agree with you on that. So did you use past papers, and what was your sort of approach to preparation? How did you prep?
Yeah, I did use past papers. I think that is a really, really important aspect of preparing for the exams. I think I did absolutely all of the past papers that existed for my language combination. I think one really effective way of using them, whether this might kind of sound like common sense, is rather than just sort of flicking through them, looking at the text and thinking that doesn't look too bad, you sort of need to take them in the context that you'll be receiving them in the exam. So I think that means sort of doing them under exam conditions, but also doing them using the resources that you will be using in the exam, as opposed to sort of perhaps using, your usual online resources. And I think that's really key, as lots of people seem to say that they kind of look at them, make a few notes and think, well, that's, achievable, but actually tackling them under the time constraints and with the resources you'll have on the day, I think is really significant for a number of reasons. Firstly, kind of looking at the importance of time management as quite a key pitfall in the exams, but also then familiarizing yourself with those resources and then asking yourself the question of whether you do have the right resources to be able to cope on the day. So definitely, I think the past papers are one of the best things that you can do in terms of preparation.
Yes, and I think that point about preparing in a way which is actually similar to the exam that you're going to take is also pretty important because I think the common feature. I interviewed some of the candidates who'd achieved the highest performances in DipTrans for our awards, and one of the things that they all said was time management is surprisingly significant. That on the face of it, it looks like there's plenty of time, but actually, the clock in the background is one of the factors that does sort of weigh on a candidate.
Yeah, excuse me. Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. I think perhaps a lot of the conversation around time management can make it feel like there's a lot of time pressure in the exam and that what you're being asked to do is not achievable in the time. And I don't think that's the case. I think that if you prepare well and you do, manage that time well, it is entirely achievable. So I think to some extent, that conversation can be a little bit counterproductive because it's quite daunting to think, oh gosh, I'm going to have to translate really, really furiously, work furiously, and I'll run out of time and it'll all be so stressful. It doesn't actually have to be like that if you're kind of well prepared. You can use your resources well, and you've got an idea about how you're going to divide up your time on the day. So you do need to manage your time, but the time you have is also quite achievable to do a good translation and check it well and complete the task well.
Very, very good. So in terms of, one aspect of this is the choice of semi-specialized units and, how that plays out in the under exam conditions. Could you say a little bit about your experience of that, how you made your choice and, whether you had a premeditated idea going in and how that played out in your experience?
Yeah, so obviously with the general paper, there's no choice of text. And I think, the best way of handling that is to have quite a bit of translation experience behind you, um, to some extent as a generalist, so you are able to tackle those varied texts, and you're not too sort of put out by seeing a text that isn't necessarily an area that you're 100% familiar with. And now in terms of the semi-specialized papers, I think to some extent the key is in the name and that it is semi-specialized. And whilst a good extent of knowledge is required in those fields, there are kind of limits to that, and you can handle that with the resources. So in Unit 2, I took the business paper, and for me that was an easy choice because that is a field I work in quite a lot, and there was no sort of doubt that I was going to do that one. I think the preparation I did for that probably only helped me with my specialism in that field, and I found the text to be okay on the day. And for Unit 3, I was a little bit torn between law and social science. And I essentially prepared both, which probably goes against the advice that I would actually give, but I did essentially prepare both. And that's because I do have quite a bit of background in working in kind of both of those areas. So I wanted to keep my options a little bit open. Um, and I had planned to take the law paper, but on the day I did actually plump for social science. There was no specific reason for that other than that when I saw the social science text, it just so happened to be an area that I really enjoy working in, and I thought, oh, I'll do that one. It wasn't that the other one was terrible. I just thought, actually, do you know what? I think I could do a better job of that paper on the day. I think my advice on that would really depend on how many fields you do regularly work in, because if you're preparing a new field for the exams, I definitely think very much, kind of focusing on that one field and not spreading yourself too thinly would definitely be the way to go. I also think that you could run into problems, potentially spending too much time choosing between the papers. So I sort of go against my own actions and say, actually, a choice in advance probably is the best way to go on balance.
Yeah, very good. Now, just to take in a couple of questions that we've had en route. Basically, what would be your advice on dictionaries?
Right. So I suppose one of the key things I would say is you need to kind of not just get the dictionaries you're going to use, a couple of days before the exams. I think you do need to be doing all of the past papers and all of the preparatory work with them, because I think, although there will be some exceptions, I think most working professional translators are likely to more heavily rely on the online resources nowadays. So perhaps going back to using those paper-based resources can feel a bit cumbersome and can feel a bit daunting, without kind of having, all of the online resources to kind of verify your translation choice. So definitely to use those resources as part of your preparation would be key. And I think in terms of the resources you actually need, it very much depends on your specific language and your specific subject choices. But I would say to try and prepare yourself as well as you can. So I think I would say you'd need a good bilingual dictionary for your language pair. And I would also say probably a good monolingual dictionary for each of your languages. So for your source language and your target language. I personally perhaps think a thesaurus might be a nice idea for your target language. And I would also perhaps say that you do need some specialist dictionaries if you're going to go for a specialist field. I would definitely say for the business paper, I would definitely recommend investing in kind of one or two specialist dictionaries for that field. Again, that very much depends on your kind of level of confidence and how you feel about that outlet if you don't already have those resources. But I would say that both in terms of the confidence that gives you, but also the ability to sort of double check your choices, I think that's really important. I think a lot of the vocabulary, the terminology that you're encountering, you're not necessarily going to be able to find even in just quite a thick bilingual dictionary. It is not going to be there. So you do need that specialist and those specialist resources. Depending on kind of your confidence with your target language and source language, I perhaps would go for something like a dictionary of idioms as well. That could be quite helpful.
Yeah, very good. I mean, I think the important thing to say here is, as you said, that these papers are semi-specialized, so they're as much about the tone, the style, and the register as they are about the particular words and terminology. So I think sometimes people do fear that there's going to be more specialized terminology, and probably the bigger challenge will be tone, register, and appropriateness, if you like, for the audience. So each of the pieces will have a rubric which will give a candidate a strong sense of what register we're looking for and the kind of style and tone that you'd be expecting. So I think perhaps sometimes people worry a little more than they need to about specific terminology, when the bigger challenge is probably appropriate tone and register.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think on the one hand, I would be careful not to sort of underplay the terminology, because ultimately you do need to be able to tackle the terminology you encounter in a clear and effective and appropriate way. But at the same time, you could have all the dictionaries in the world on your desk, but ultimately if you're not kind of writing in the right tone and the right style, you will still kind of fall down on that. So it's a combination of both, really, I would say.
Yeah, very good. So should we talk a little bit about overall exam strategy then? So what was your approach to overall exam strategy?
I think definitely a lot of that came into how I kind of work generally as a translator, but also how I found tackling the past papers in the sort of time that I'd set aside for those. I would say, making sure that you can finish the papers on time is the kind of is the key, is the key to that. And I think my exam strategy would be obviously to have everything prepared sort of well in advance, and kind of putting that aside when you're in the space and the exam time has started. I think the most important thing to do is to choose the paper you're actually going to do quickly. I think a lot of candidates can kind of fall down, thinking, oh gosh, am I going to do law or social science? I'm, reading each one, that takes time, reading the other one, then perhaps going back to one, starting another paper, and then changing their minds. I think it's really important not to do that. Now, as a translator, my personal approach is usually I do work quite quickly when I'm doing a first draft of a translation, and I'll then spend lots of time editing and lots of time on the improvement process. And I think that transfers really well to something like the DipTrans, because I think when you're sat there, you have the blank screen in front of you, the time started ticking, you've got the text, you've got your dictionaries, and you think, oh gosh, where do I start? I think just getting down your translation on paper, on screen, so to speak, ASAP, that does make a difference, because it really kind of removes the daunting element out of what you're doing. Once you've started and once you have a first draft, no matter how rough a first draft of that translation, you have the bare bones of what you're working with, and then you can improve and improve and improve upon that and keep editing that until your time's up. So I think that really takes away the sort of panic and the fear, essentially, of trying to create a perfect translation that's got the perfect tone of voice, the perfect style straight off in your first draft. That's at least how I work, that's not going to happen. So I like to work quickly, get my first draft down, and then spend ages honing it, I guess.
Yeah, very good. And that process of leaving enough time to go back and and thoroughly proof something is always great advice. I mean, confidence is a factor as well. So obviously the preparation and the time that you put into it in advance helped. Was there anything that you did in the day before or in the hours before just to get yourself into the right frame of mind? I mean, I'm thinking perhaps about your environment and sort of how you set yourself up for the exam on the day.
Yeah, so I actually I did end up having quite a lot of paper dictionaries, and I found on the desk that I usually work on that was a bit cumbersome alongside my computer and my keyboard. So I actually set up in our dining room for the exams because I felt sort of having a larger table was useful in terms of sort of using those paper-based resources, but also having enough space to type and not feeling like I was too cramped. So I suppose for me on the day, it was kind of all about the practicalities. I was really lucky that I was able to ship our daughter and dogs over to
I was going to
my
ask you about
mum's.
that. Yes, you have
Yeah.
2 Dachshunds, don't you, and a daughter. So I imagine that handling that was an important thing.
Yeah, I didn't really want the distraction of knowing that they're in the house and knowing that I could potentially be disturbed by that. I think that would have just been sort of too stressful for everyone. And luckily, I was able to send them to my mum's for the day, which obviously I appreciate is not always achievable. But I think making your environment as calm and as focused as is achievable, and making anyone else who will be kind of in the building aware that you need complete quiet and complete calm, so that you're not sort of worrying about that. That's an unnecessary kind of extra worry that you just don't need, alongside trying to focus on the exams. So I would definitely say just trying to create a calm and productive environment. It's even small things like we had a Amazon Alexa in our dining room, kind of stuck up on top of a bookshelf, which obviously make sure you kind of unplug that. Just make sure anything that could possibly get in the way is unplugged and out of the way, so that nothing like that kind of goes wrong on the day. And really it's just kind of thinking about what you need and how you need to be set up to be productive.
Yes, I think that's very wise. I mean, albeit there is convenience in taking these exams at home, they are still, formal public exams, invigilated, and with pretty high stakes. So it is worth taking the time to set yourself up properly, and to the greatest extent possible, reduce the things that could throw you off balance. Or just distract you when you're, at the peak of productivity. So yeah, I would really agree with that. So in terms of, one other factor, and I know you've got some questions for me, but one other factor that plays in is sometimes, unfortunately, people are not successful first time around, or may be successful in a couple of papers, but not the third. So what would you have to say about the topic of retakes?
Um, yeah, I think it's a sort of tricky topic that people do get understandably quite worried about. I think that it's obviously absolutely fine to retake a couple of papers, and that if you need to do that, ultimately achieving each of the unit papers separately doesn't detract from the overall qualification that you will ultimately get if you have the right skills.
Mm.
So I think, it's not something to get kind of too hung up about going into the exams, because in my opinion, if you do have to retake some, that's absolutely fine. Something can just go wrong for you on the day. I think if you're approaching a retake, the likelihood is you're probably only retaking, one or two. So that gives you more time to kind of focus on the specific papers. And provided that isn't the general paper, that probably gives you more time to sort of delve deeper into that semi-specialized area. Perhaps that might be science, or perhaps that might be, the new arts and culture paper. I think, get any feedback which is available and sort of take action on that. But I think also to just kind of take heart from the fact that, if you have the background and you have the skills, and if the qualification is really important to you, you can retake. And once you pass, ultimately you will have the same qualification as if you passed first time. So I would say absolutely, if your goal is to achieve the DipTrans, absolutely to go for the retakes, to get as much information as possible at your fingertips, and to kind of delve deeper into specialisms. I've kind of spoken to quite a few people who've said, you know, they had to retake because ultimately, you know, their kind of level of knowledge in their specialism perhaps just wasn't quite at the standard which was expected. You know, that's something that you absolutely can work on and absolutely can improve. Quite often as well, I think people will have a good idea for themselves what has gone wrong on the day or what they could improve on or need to improve on.
Yeah, very, very good. I mean, I would also say that each individual unit gets its own full unit certificate and is a valid qualification and a valid a recognition in its own right. So, and also what you say, I think when you if you do retake, when you add all the units together, you absolutely have the same qualification, because basically it is I think a fair and straight test of ability and of translation skill, and to some extent, once that level has been achieved, that's it. It's been achieved. So there's absolutely no downside or detriment in coming up short on some aspect of it. It can happen to anybody.
Yeah, definitely. And I think in terms of the unit certificates, that's a really good point. And actually, you know, they do kind of have value in their own right, especially I think in terms of kind of if you pass one of the semi-specialized papers. I definitely think in terms of kind of supporting your specialism and being able to verify, you know, your knowledge and skill perhaps in one of your specialisms. So say you're successful in passing the technology unit, and that is an area that you're kind of really kind of trying to push forwards in terms of acquiring clients in that field. You know, you are able to actually kind of document and prove your skill in that specific area, and that can be really valuable. So they are, I would say, useful in their own right, definitely.
Yes. Yes. So there's just a couple of questions from the audience that we could do. One is around whether, take for example, the law unit, whether a legal background would be a prerequisite or necessary to be successful in the law unit. And I suppose the same would be true of the other units as well, whether you would need a science background or a technology background. And I think what we would probably both say, but you tell me if you differ from this, is that of course it's going to be helpful if you have a legal background on the law paper, but it certainly wouldn't be absolutely 100% necessary, because these are semi-specialized, and with the right preparation, a well-prepared candidate should be able to be successful in all 7 of the semi-specialized.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think it depends really what you mean by a legal background. I think it depends, perhaps you might mean, you know, you have worked in law in your own right, or it might mean you've worked in legal translation. I would say having worked in legal translation is really, really important in terms of kind of gaining that confidence of having some experience of having been using those kinds of texts, using that kind of language and working with those texts, I think is really important. Whether or not, you know, you need any specific legal qualifications, of course, the more knowledge you have, probably the better. But at the same time, you know, it's fully achievable with just legal translation experience and legal translation knowledge. It's very much translation based, and your knowledge is translation based, albeit within a specialist area. So you don't need to sort of have a great deal of legal knowledge and sort of facts and figures at your fingertips. It's more having the skill to be able to accurately translate those kinds of texts. So definitely experience working in the particular field in a translation context is I would say quite important. But again, you know, I think the clue is somewhat in the name, and that they are known as semi-specialized papers. And some of the areas of semi-specialization are really quite broad. You know, take technology or science. You know, they are just vast fields, and sort of being an expert in science is, you know, entirely probably unachievable as a lifetime's work in and of itself. So it is kind of being comfortable in that field, being comfortable writing in that field. But I think the level of really in-depth knowledge in all fields of science, you know, is relatively low. I'm not quite sure if that answers the question, but I think it's kind of having the knowledge and the confidence and just a really good understanding of how people write in those fields and how you would need to pitch the tone of voice for it to come across effectively. And, you know, good resources at your fingertips that if you're not sure of terminology, because you're not an expert in that particular area, you can refer to one of those resources that you brought into the exam with you.
Yes, I think that's exactly right, and it goes back to what we were saying around the advantage of having had a bit of translation experience, because you're likely to have been exposed to a broad range of different types and genres, and have had will have had feedback on it, and also that the style is important. One only has to think about great benefits of modern life, the ease of accessing different sorts of news outlets, and the difference between the Scientific American, Time magazine, or National Geographic. They're sort of all different in style and tone in subtle ways, and that's some of what we're getting at, I think, here.
Yeah, sure.
Right, now there are a couple of questions that we could have a go at, probably more for me. Do you really need a DipTrans if you already have a master's in translation? My take on that would be that master's in translation, if you have the time to do a master's, it's a wonderful thing, but often you're exploring over an extended period quite a variety of subject matter which is related to the academic endeavour itself. How to understand a discipline, how to understand the parameters around a discipline, critical argument. There are all sorts of things that go into a degree or a postgraduate degree which are incredibly valuable, but are not specifically to the task of practical translation. So I think the great strength of the DipTrans is it absolutely demonstrates that you can do what it says on the tin. You are a practiced and excellent translator. What would you say, Olivia?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously being able to do a master's in translation is brilliant. I think depending on the degree, they can be sort of more or less practically focused, more or less academically focused. And I think in that regard, they obviously do have a great deal of value, but at the same time, I think the DipTrans is quite different in that it's sort of concretely testing your practical translation skill, under exam conditions. And I think that's much more realistic to the kind of skills that you need to be providing as a professional translator. So I would say, based on my knowledge of the DipTrans and of sort of some master's programs in translation, I think it's much more practically focused, and you're kind of really proving those practical skills in your chosen professional field, and I think that that's really valuable. But again, it's really complex when it comes to the question of, do you need something? Probably not. It's probably not entirely essential, but I think it's an absolutely brilliant way of kind of standing out from the crowd, and of kind of proving that skill to your clients, and can often sort of simplify the process of being onboarded by a new client as well, if you're looking at working for agencies.
Yeah, great stuff. And there's a similar question from someone who's perhaps a bit earlier in their career or academic life around the sort of undergraduate qualifications. And I suspect we would both say the same thing there, that of course there are undergraduate degrees which would have an element of translation in them, but undergraduate language degrees can be very varied in their content and focus. And this is a stretching qualification, so probably people would need to be pretty confident about the work they had undertaken at that level to feel that they were ready for the DipTrans. Would you agree with that, Olivia?
I guess it's entirely possible also that this candidate is actually doing an undergrad degree in translation and could be already focusing on translation at that early stage.
Yes.
But at the same time, the DipTrans is kind of pitched at postgrad level, so I think that is very much sort of the level that it equates to and the level that it's pitched at. But of course, skill levels do vary so broadly amongst kind of undergrads and postgrads. So it's quite difficult to say without kind of knowing the specific candidate. But if I had to generalize, I would definitely recommend just having that practical experience of translating, efficiently and effectively in a professional context, because I think that kind of that level of efficiency and that kind of confidence of handling a text, on your own does provide you, I think, with the kind of background that you would really benefit from going into the exams. But that said, I'm sure there are exceptions to the rule. So if you feel like you already meet those criteria and you are at undergrad level, then maybe it is worth considering in more detail. But if I had to generalize, I'd definitely sort of pitch it at postgrad level.
Yes, I think the only thing that I would add to that, and this is based on talking to people who have studied in other international education systems, is there are some parts of the world where, and I'm thinking in particular Central and Eastern Europe, where standards of translation training at undergraduate and indeed master's level are exceptionally high. So I think it's worth recognizing, again, not generalizing, but depending on what system you have done your degree in, people can have exceptionally high standards of translation ability. I interviewed someone from Romania who had all of the degrees that that you could have in that system, and was an astonishing translator. So I think it is also, it does vary from education system to education system, and of course depending on the linguistic context in which someone's learning, in terms of the country and the languages they're exposed to. So all of those factors are in play, not to mention bilingualism and multilingualism. Now, in terms of questions that you might have for me, Olivia, I mean, I guess there are some kind of classic questions that people always want to ask about the DipTrans. Have you got any that you'd like to try on me?
Yeah, definitely. I think I'd be quite curious to hear your thoughts on retakes, because that is one of the things that seems to come up quite a bit. People are worried about having to retake. They're concerned, perhaps, they can't necessarily retake an unlimited number of times.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps concerned that there's a sort of a little bit of a limited time frame in which to actually achieve the full qualification. And I'd just be curious to hear your perspective on that, really. How worried do you think someone needs to be about retakes as a general concept?
Well, I think things have changed in, over the past years. One of the more significant changes, perhaps, is bringing in more regular DipTrans rounds. So they're twice a year now, as opposed to the once a year pattern. And then in terms of the timescale for taking it, which is now 3 years, we sort of had a balance to strike, really, between a number of opportunities and, I guess, being realistic about the likely time frame that most candidates would want to complete in. So, we think that we've got the right balance here: 3 years and potentially six attempts if you take into account all of the sittings. And I would say that you've got to be careful of generalizations, because every individual is different, but people are successful when they retake. So I think it's very, very important to recognize that people who go again are very often successful, and people who decide they want to get this qualification generally do. So I think it is a case of what you were saying, absolutely no shame in finding on the day that it didn't quite work for you, and people generally come back strongly second time around, or indeed third time around. I mean, it's it's hardly comparable, but many people don't pass their driving test first time around. I certainly didn't, and I think I'm a much better driver for having to do it again. So I do think that there's absolutely no negativity about anyone who, for all the various reasons, might come up a bit short on the day.
No, that's good to hear. I think that's definitely reassuring. Another thing that people often ask and are kind of wondering about, and it can feel quite daunting when you're looking at the exams, is there's sort of can be a lot of talk about the DipTrans being a difficult qualification, which I would say that it is. It is challenging and it is demanding, but I also personally think that it is achievable if you have the right skill level kind of behind you. Are you able to kind of provide us an idea of how many people actually pass the exam, on each attempt?
Yes, look, I mean, this has to come with caveats, because it all depends on the cohort, and the performance of individuals, and the aggregate can be misleading, because it could be a combination of languages, choices, and just the individual candidates that came to us on that particular day. But to give you a sort of a guide, in recent years, the pass rate is probably somewhere between a third and half of candidates would tend to pass, and in recent years, it's probably been closer to a half than a third. I think if you were to go back historically, over the decades, probably historically the average might have been closer to the third than the half. But now I would say the average is close to the half. You do get some variance on semi-specialized, But I don't think that variance is what people sometimes believe it to be, which is that some semi-specialized are just fundamentally harder than others. I think it's more to do with just the spread of performance in a given round. So I think they are pretty, they do vary, but it's not that one is particularly tricky and another one isn't. The new semi-specialized arts and culture had a very, very high success rate in its first outing, so people did well on that. But again, that may be to do with interest and preparation, because we did introduce that based on candidate feedback that they would like to see a semi-specialized in arts and culture, but there was a strong pass rate on that. And I think the other thing to say, and we'll go on to it if you want to, but I think the introduction of the certificate in translation, the SearchTrans, will also have an impact here, because I would say that there are a proportion of candidates who have perhaps taken the DipTrans in the past who maybe hadn't quite understood what the qualification was or what the standard was, and maybe just weren't really quite ready for it. So I think that potentially introducing the certificate in translation and also having a more rounded conversation with people about where they are in their journey, might actually help the pass rates in the DipTrans over time as well, because some people will have tried the SearchTrans and will have gained confidence and practice there. And also, I think the fact that there are two qualifications to look at. So I'm just thinking about the question we had earlier from someone who was sort of indicating that they might feel they're not quite ready for the DipTrans. The answer might be to look at the SearchTrans and get that under your belt, and then push on for the DipTrans when your confidence is in the right place, because the DipTrans is a step on from the SearchTrans.
Yeah, definitely. I think another area that I'd quite like to kind of quiz you on, because it worried me when I was going into the exams, is that, what if I feel kind of less capable or less confident without being able to use, the electronic resources, the online resources that I probably use as a natural part of my day job, and I think are largely accepted to be a really productive way of being a translator in this day and age. I was wondering really if there are any plans to update the exam format in the future to essentially allow translators to make use of online resources rather than predominantly paper dictionaries.
Yes, this is a real dilemma, and what I would say also, when we if we go back to the pass rate question, I think people can be very reassured by the moderation processes that we run. So moderation within language groups, moderation across language groups, and moderation across the semi-specialized units. And it's a pretty comprehensive process where everything gets cross-checked and moderated. And I think that is important for people to know. I've lost the think link now. What was your question again?
Whether there's sort of any plans to update the exam format to allow us to use online resources.
That's the reason. So at the core of a public qualification has to be fairness and comparability. So to the central issue, yes, there is an issue, I guess, around people having much better tools. So you could find yourself in a situation where someone had far better tools than somebody else if you allowed complete freedom to use tools. If we were to offer a narrowly configured tool, let's say a vanilla browser, the other issue that we would have would be really different performance across language families. And this is the challenge that we have in terms of meeting the standards of a public qualification, that we need to have comparability over time, although obviously exams can be enhanced, improved, and can evolve. But fairness to previous candidates, I think, is a factor. But the biggest factor is the leveling across languages and the very different performance that you get from electronic resources depending on which language family you're in. So that's the one that we haven't yet managed to find an acceptable answer to, but we certainly are thinking about it, and we do recognise that in particular for people, if they're thinking of buying specialized dictionaries just for the one exam, it is frustrating for people. So completely aware of it. Fairness is the challenge.
Okay, yeah, that's understandable. And I think something that was sort of stressing me out before the exam was, what do I do if everything's prepared on the day of the exam and something goes wrong? So my internet connection fails, like my dog barks, my child just comes bursting in, I'm feeling poorly during the exam, or just what do I do if I'm sitting the exam and the unexpected happens, despite me having prepared everything to ensure that it didn't?
Well, look, I think what you said about preparation is really, really important. Setting oneself up for success is helpful, and if you can do that, that's always going to help. We are flexible. We do try and help people. Sometimes people have some issues at the start of the exam, kind of getting on board. We will try to be flexible, and we're trying to help everyone to be as successful as they possibly can. But fundamentally, if the equipment, if your internet connection is dead and the equipment isn't there, then that is an issue. So I do think testing in advance, making sure everything works, and then of course, there's a kind of a pre-check that you can do on system as well to make sure that your settings are compatible, because we have a secure platform which needs to be just checked. There's nothing about it which is unusual, but sometimes cookie settings or other things can just need interfering. And then the other thing is making sure it doesn't happen on these exams, but it does happen on some of our other exams, that people turn up with equipment which isn't quite the right specification. So I think that preparation that's done in advance, the space, avoid the distractions, and have the right equipment, and test it with the Rogo platform, is all good practice. And we will absolutely bend over backwards on the day. I mean, the team are fantastic in this regard to try and get people connected online and up and running. But fundamentally, it is a public exam.
Yeah, okay. And how common is it, would you say, for someone to pass the DipTrans translating into a non-native language? Is that something that you see a lot? I mean, I have heard of some instances myself, but I'm just curious to know if you had any sort of more information.
Look, there's absolutely nothing to say that it can't be done. It's a pure case of the preparation and the skill level. I think we would generally say, both as CIOL and as an examining body, we would generally say that it's unusual, for people to take the DipTrans, or indeed to do that level of translation in a third language. But of course, it all depends on what language family it is, and and the background of the individual. So there's absolutely nothing which says it can't be done. But it is comparatively unusual in translation circles, and comparatively difficult. But of course, it is possible.
Sure. Okay. Is there anything else that you wanted to sort of ask me again?
I think just one other kind of build on the point you just made. Sometimes people do both directions at once, and again, that is perfectly possible. Why not? And if you're in the mind to prepare for one, then you could argue that there's an economy to be made in preparing for two. All we would say is that is really super stretching in terms of time management, in terms of the week itself, and how much kind of brain space anyone is going to have. So absolutely, there's nothing to stop you from doing it, but it might make sense just to pace yourself and phase it over a couple of DipTrans rounds if you're thinking of doing that. I think going for both ways at once is is stretching.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you raised a good point there in terms of the actual week itself. Perhaps even if you do have a comparable competence in both directions, I think in terms of the sort of perhaps brain fog that would induce trying to do all of those exams in the same week. It's relatively tiring as it is, so I'd definitely say if that's something that you were going to be looking at doing, I would probably spread it out over multiple exam sessions as well. I think also in terms of kind of being in the flow and in the zone of using one particular language, that will be harder to kind of chop and change between them, depending on when your individual exams sort of happen to be scheduled. I think I would find that to be too much personally. So I would definitely recommend sort of doing one, also learning from the process of doing one. I'd say do your stronger one first, and then move on to the other one if that's what you wanted to do.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I mean, the only other thing that perhaps people are wondering, again, we've sort of slightly touched on it, but DipTrans versus SearchTrans, and what's the difference, and which one should I take? And just to say a little bit about the certificate in translation degree level, in kind of Common European Framework of Reference CEFR terms, we're talking C1 kind of level, and it's a shorter, more straightforward text, and also a fractionally more forgiving marking scheme. So undoubtedly, the SearchTrans is it's about establishing working level translation skills, and no one should think that it's simple, but it does represent a different level of challenge from the DipTrans. So I think if someone has wants to establish themselves, wants to test themselves, and isn't quite sure whether they're ready for the DipTrans, then the SearchTrans is a really great qualification to look at. The cohort that has just taken it, just to give you an indication, I mean, it was a very strong cohort. And as I said earlier, it is all about the cohort. Ultimately, it's about the individuals who put themselves forward and their performance. But a strong cohort, but also a very, very strong pass mark. So nearly 80% of people passed the SearchTrans. So I think that that also is, reassuring for us as an institute, that that qualification is doing the job it's intended to do, which is give people confidence, demonstrate they have the skills, and get them into working as professional linguists. So SearchTrans is also, if you have a doubt, worth looking at, and that is also a very good solution for further languages or into your second language. So that's another way to add that string to your bow, on your LinkedIn profile, in a more straightforward way, perhaps, than trying to do DipTrans both ways.
Yeah, definitely. I think it also might be interesting to look at taking the SearchTrans. Perhaps if you have two language pairs, people usually have kind of varying levels of interest and competence, and perhaps just speed and efficiency and experience with different language pairs. So you could perhaps even consider, taking the DipTrans for your main language pair, and then taking the SearchTrans for your slightly rarer language pair.
Yes, and on that, you take for example your Russian. We are very open to expanding the range of languages that is offered for the SearchTrans. So it's a simple case of candidate demand. If it's there, then we'll provide it, and we have an expressions of interest form on the website now. So if you are interested in languages that we're not currently offering, because it's Arabic, Chinese, French, German, and Spanish at the moment. If you're interested in other languages, then tell us, and if the candidate demand is there, we can have Russian, we can have Italian, we can have Greek, and whatever people are looking for. So pure case of interest. Yeah. I think that's probably all I had, to say. Olivia, is there anything else that you would want to ask me, or? I think we've covered most of the questions that people had.
To be honest, I think that does kind of does wrap up most of what I was looking to add quite nicely. Do we have any other questions coming up from?
Yeah, just one last question actually from the audience, which is, are we considering adding Romanian into English into the DipTrans? I think the short answer to that is, again, we have an expressions of interest form now for the DipTrans, which enables you to tell us in what kind of time frame you might be thinking about taking the DipTrans, and also in what language combinations. So again, very straightforwardly, it's probably likely that there'll always be more language combinations for the DipTrans. But certainly, if you let us know and there is demand for it, we'll be more than happy to put it on. But it does depend on candidate demand, because obviously the costs of commissioning, marking, and all the rest of it, we do have to cover our costs if we can.
Yeah, of course.
Well, in that case, I think that all that remains perhaps, Olivia, is to thank you very, very much for sharing your insights. Obviously, huge congratulations on your success, because I know it was a very, very strong performance. And thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure, and hopefully it's been really useful to people who are kind of either on the fence about taking it or just feeling uncertain about sort of how best to start their preparation and go about that.
Fantastic. Now, the only other thing I would say is that obviously there's an enormous amount of information on the website. Strongly recommend that everybody read the qualification specification. I know it sounds a little bit of a dry read, but it is incredibly useful, I think, to properly read the qualification specification. That would be the number one top tip I would give over and above what you've already said. Thanks, everybody.
Definitely. Thank you.